The Nigerian Economic Summit Group, in its role as connector, dialogue partner, watchdog, and intervener,
when you first start business, your target is to make your first million.
Seeks to change the narrative and trajectory of the Nigerian economy. Together with our partners, we're not just solving problems, but preventing them, because when advocacy succeeds, the nation transforms for the better. But advocacy is for the strong. It takes fact-based inputs, resilience, partnerships, courage, and a lot of heroes. So be our hero. Subscribe to our channel, listen to our messages, and engage with us. Together, we can transform Nigerian lives, communities, and businesses. Welcome to the NESG Radio.
In brief, can you please tell us what the Debt Management Roundtable is all about?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think every country, whether they are developed or underdeveloped or emerging markets, whatever it may be, require resources to run government and to provide, the necessary social needs and services for their people. So whenever your budget does not add up in terms of revenue compared to your expenditure, you then have to borrow. So I think the starting point is to say that borrowing is indeed necessary for countries, even so for businesses and individuals. But then if you get to a point where there are concerns in terms of the terms for those borrowings, in terms of your ability to meet those terms, in terms of the utilization of the funds you're borrowing, and your ability to essentially service them and pay back when they fall due, it could become a source of concern and worry for citizens, for businesses, and for the general public. So the mandate of the Debt Management Roundtable, which is an initiative by the Nigerian Economic Summit Group, we support by the Open Society Initiative for West African Countries, OSIWA, is to say, rather than just analyze and complain, why can't we come together and look at what can we provide in terms of insights to governments across the sub-region? And then more importantly, what can we do to help them ensure that there's better management of their debt for sustainability and for long-term prosperity for their people? That would be the way I'll summarize the mandate of the Debt Management Roundtable.
Are there concerns that debt could become unsustainable in the nearest future?
The answer to that is yes. The countries within West Africa, of course, also vary in terms of their revenue profile, in terms of their debt profile. You see debt to GDP ratio maybe ranging between, anywhere 20-25 to up to 65%. So Nigeria is a country we're focusing on the most as the case study for our mandate for two reasons. One is the biggest economy within Ecowas or West African countries. Then the second reason is because whatever happens in Nigeria can easily be replicated in terms of best practice in these other countries. So there are concerns around, debt sustainability, debt management, efficiency of how we manage the money we borrow, whether they're from the IMF or other international organizations, or whether they're from the market like Euro bonds. And I think the primary source of concern for Nigeria in particular is not really the debt to GDP ratio, because that's still within the international threshold, but we're actually interrogating whether those international thresholds are indeed appropriate for West African countries. Because if we take Nigeria, for example, our debt to GDP ratio is still under 35%, but our debt service cost to revenue is over 70% for the federal government, which is already pointing towards a debt crisis. So there are concerns, and those concerns are what can we do to make sure that those terms, including the cost of servicing debt, including the debt to GDP ratio, and the other, benchmarks are, in fact, including how you even measure the debts you have. Should you include ways and means, which is the central bank financing? Are we staying within the parameters of how much we should borrow from the central bank? Do we have the debt of our agencies like MDAs included in our measurements? So all these issues, because if you don't transparently report how much you are owing, that in itself becomes a problem. So all of these issues combined are the things we're looking at to be able to ensure that debt management within the sub-region is indeed sustainable.
Again, so following from your response, debt to GDP is not showing any serious problem, but in terms of debt service to revenue, we are seeing significant problem, particularly for Nigeria, likewise in some other countries. As a result of this, some of the stakeholders are crying for debt forgiveness and debt cancellation. In your opinion, do you think this is sufficient to tackle the debt problem in Nigeria and some of these West African countries?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, maybe we need to do a lot more public education because sometimes the reactions are out of proportion, I may put it that way. So when government, introduces a budget and they say we're going to spend 13 trillion naira, but we're expecting revenue of 8 trillion naira, and we have a budget deficit of 5 trillion or 6 trillion naira. They're already saying to you that they want to borrow. So at that point, Nigerians tend to not say anything. They completely ignore it. And when it's time to implement the budget and government is trying to borrow, you see a lot of reactions. But this is just government trying to implement what has been enacted into law. As we have seen in Nigeria as well in the past few days, the federal government has also again passed into law an appropriation bill, which is now an appropriation act of almost 1 trillion naira to try and take care of issues relating to COVID-19 and insecurity. So this does not mean that our revenue has increased by 1 trillion. It simply means that our deficit has increased further, which means government needs to even borrow more. Having said that, the point is, while the debt to GDP ratio is within acceptable limits as defined internationally, our cost of debt to revenue is becoming spiraling out of control, and that needs to be addressed. So I would say that if you then think about debt forgiveness, you have to put it in context. So during the Obasanjo regime, Nigeria was essentially owing the Paris Club and the international community. And these were people who could waive your debt and forgive you because they have the means to do that. That is not the same story as we have today. A lot of the debt that we have in Nigeria are debts from the capital market, from Euro bonds. So these are just investors, including Nigerians, including businesses, including institutional investors who are investing pension funds of different people. They do not have the capacity to waive the debt, and we cannot force them to waive it. Otherwise, there will be significant negative consequences for the country. While on one hand, there's nothing wrong with looking at your debt portfolio and looking for opportunities for waivers, renegotiation of the terms, there's nothing wrong with that. But we need to be mindful that a significant portion of the debt that we have in Nigeria will not be eligible for waiver or any forgiveness.
In that case, what strategy do you suggest that could be deployed in the short to medium term to ensure debt sustainability?
Yeah, I'll say maybe there are three components to this question, and it's a very important question. So if you think about debt in itself is not a problem, it's a symptom of a problem. And that problem has three dimensions. The first dimension is revenue. What can you do to increase your revenue? So for Nigeria, the fact is that not everybody who has the ability to pay is paying their fair share of taxes. So which means government needs to look for different ways, especially using data and intelligence, redesigning the tax system to ensure that we can increase our revenue profile as a country. So the second dimension is in terms of your expenditure. So can you reprioritize? Can you try and look for ways of efficiency? Can you find a way to cut down on waste? Even when you have capital expenditure in Nigeria, sometimes, the general language of it's padded. So you're spending, 10 billion for something that could have been done for half the amount, which is why some of the initiatives around, public-private partnership, we're finding that the private sector is constructing roads at a fraction of what government would have spent with better quality. So private sector's quality is better and the cost is lower. So can we get government to also try and drive some efficiency in that regard? And the third dimension to this is what other alternatives you have for funding public expenditure. It is not everything that government has to spend their money to do. Why should government borrow to construct railways and buy rails? Why should government borrow to provide public buses? Because Labour is complaining about subsidy. In fact, also my second point around waste is you need to think about something like subsidy on petrol and subsidy on electricity. Are you subsidizing the right people? Should there be subsidy at all? So the third dimension then is what expenses can you take out of your book and get the private sector to do it more efficiently? To be able to accomplish this, if you think about projects like electricity, like rail, like ports, like airports, these are areas where private sectors all over the world do excellent and amazing job. They will find the money, they will fund it, they will provide the project, good quality, they will make their money. In fact, they will make profit and pay taxes to government. So if you explore these three dimensions, I think we'll be addressing the crisis that is looming in terms of managing Nigerian debt, and we can turn the corner to change the narrative for our debt management story.
Okay, so just with your response, I've been able to answer some of my questions, but I would like you to shed more light, particularly to the fact that we are already in a debt situation that is concerning. So what measure do you think the government can adopt to probably specific ones now, maybe, to probably adjust the debt situation that we are in? Beyond talking about alternative ways of taming debt accumulation, like the current situation, how do you think we can address it to achieve sustainability in our debt profile?
Unfortunately, the practical answer is that Nigerian government will still have to borrow even more. So as at the time we're having this conversation, by the end of the year, our debt profile would have increased because there's no any magic you can perform in the short term. Government will still have to borrow more. So having said that, what can we do to start turning the tide in terms of the direction in which we're going? A few things. When a country borrows, really, to be honest, you don't have to pay back ever. So a country can have a debt to GDP ratio of 60%, 70%, and you keep it at that rate for generations. You can keep it there for 200 years. Because every time that any of your debt, matures, you just refinance it. So you just borrow again to pay the one that has matured. So really, the debt itself is not the problem. The major problem is this cost of servicing the debt. So which means for Nigeria, I'll be concerned, like many Nigerians, about the cost of servicing debt. So what can we do? So the question therefore should be, what can we do about moderating the cost of servicing debt? In the medium to long term, if your economy grows, your GDP grows faster than the rate at which you borrow. So it will bring down your debt to GDP ratio. If your revenue revenue streams grow faster than your expenditure, you will moderate the cost of servicing debt. Also, if the rate at which you borrow is moderated and goes down, so Nigeria borrows sometimes at double digits, if not most times. Whereas countries like the US, we borrow at close to 0%. In fact, there are countries where they borrow at negative rates. So they borrow $1 million from you, and with the understanding that they shall pay you back less than $1 million, and they're still able to borrow negative interest rates. So for Nigeria, we then have to look at these different aspects of one, how can we ensure that the rate of borrowing goes down? And this happened, over the past 1.5 years, even though that also created a problem of negative real returns on investments and savings. But trying to find how do we bring down our borrowing rates will be one aspect. Another aspect is how do you grow your revenue base so that you're not spending 70% in trying to service your debt. And one of it, certainly, is looking at the tax laws. We have too many taxes in Nigeria. So multiplicity of taxes is a problem. So Nigerians pay a lot of taxes, but government collects so little. Why is that? Because a lot of the taxes Nigerians pay are paid to non-state actors. We had some report recently indicating that the agberos in Lagos alone and the taxi association of transporters collect more in revenue than 35 states in Nigeria. So if they were to be a state, they would be ranking maybe number 3. Next only to Lagos and maybe FCT or Rivers State. Now, this is not the way to manage your debt situation. So what if we harmonize our taxes, limit them to a few, use technology to collect those taxes so that the possibility of non-state actors collecting revenue from innocent people will be reduced, and those revenues will be channeled to government coffers, and that will raise your revenue profile significantly. We also have some agency of government that are collecting revenue, and they either don't account for those revenue to government or they don't do so on time. We also need to address multiplicity of revenue agencies. Let's harmonize it such that only one agency of government is collecting revenue per level of government, federal, state, and maybe also local governments. So once you begin to address this, what you see is an increase in your revenue. This has been done to some extent in Kaduna State. So I'm not even referring to any foreign country or state. So Kaduna State harmonized their tax laws, and they also automated everything to say you can no longer pay taxes in cash. And over a period of less than 5 years, the revenue of Kaduna State increased by more than 300%. So this is something that has been done right here in Nigeria. It can be replicated. If we can increase our revenue for the country by just 100%, it means that our debt service costs as a ratio of revenue will go down significantly.
Like, what are the key messages of the debt management roundtable to Ecowas countries?
I think our key messages will be, number one, it's important for policymakers and political leaders who have the responsibility for managing our economies, including our debt, to do so in a responsible manner, and do so also using the best resources available to them. When you need to negotiate terms for these agreements to borrow, ensure that you put your best foot forward so they can help us negotiate rates and terms that are affordable and sustainable. Ensure that when you have to borrow, you absolutely do so when it's necessary, and you do so for productive purposes. Countries like Singapore have a very high percentage of debt, but they also have a high percentage of national assets because they borrow essentially to invest. So those debts are self-funding and self-financing. So we need to look at that within the West Africa region so that when we borrow to fund capital projects and self-financing projects. You may also borrow to fund human capital development in form of education and in form of healthcare. They don't pay returns immediately, but they do pay returns in the medium to long term. So I think responsible management of our debt is important. Putting our best foot forward in how we manage it and managing our debt efficiently for the interest of the generation now and generation unborn. Politicians and policymakers should not take a short-term perspective. Your tenure is 4 years and therefore you want to accumulate all debt. You leave the stage and allow the next person to worry about it. While you're doing that, you're creating problems for the nation, and that will not be appropriate. The Debt Management Roundtable is there to support. We're not just criticizing, we're providing practical solutions as to how we manage our debt within West Africa in a sustainable manner.
Thank you for listening to our content today. Remember to subscribe to the NESG Radio. Follow us across all social media channels and visit our website www.nesgru.org/NESG Radio. NESG, in the national interest.